as the voice just said. And then we will post it on the Sustainable Energy Initiative website afterwards. And that's partially also because we had a lot of traffic. We also knew people who couldn't see this, so we will post the video shortly after we finish, so that people can go back and review, and also those who couldn't be here can have a look. So with that, what I'm going to do is hand the floor over to Doug, and Doug is going to go into screen sharing mode, and he will be speaking for about 30 or 35 minutes, giving an overview of the main arguments of the book. Doug.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you very much to all of you for being here today. I'm so pleased that the number of people who are interested in hearing what I have to say in this book. This book represents work I've been doing on Canadian climate change policy since 2008, pulling together my research and writing and thinking about where we sit in this country. And then I spent the last 3 years writing it, and then it just came out in March. So it's my baby, and now it's out there in the big wide world. I've had some feedback from a couple of people who have read the book and have very kindly offered me some thoughts, but this is my first real chance, this webinar, to have a little bit of discussion. So as Mark said, I'm going to be talking for 35, 40 minutes at the most, and I'm going to be running through a slide screen as long as I can get that set up. And then we'll move into question and answer. But also, it's not just questions. If you've got comments, or if there's something that you violently disagree with, by all means, this is the chance. We're in a seminar discussion mode. So I'm going to, with any luck at all.
Double click, yeah.
Okay, Mark, are we there with the slides?
We do indeed have it.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through, as Mark said, and we'll then move to questions and answers once we're through. So this is the cover of the book, Carbon Province, Hydro Province, the Challenge of Canadian Energy and Climate Federalism. And the concept of the carbon province is the oil producing provinces, the hydro provinces, the others. You may have trouble reading the fine print there. Oh, this isn't,
Nope.
There we are. Sorry, we're working now. So this is what's shown in the two bubbles there. And as you can see, we've got emissions going up in the oil producing provinces, going down in others. And to my mind, this is the basic problem of Canadian climate change policy, the fact that we're going down two very different tracks, but we never talk about it in this country, but it has the effect that the increases are overwhelming the decreases, and so we continually fail to meet our international targets. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to set out a way in which we might be able to get the whole country going on a decrease mode. So I start by making the argument that the only way we can move to more effective climate change policy is by this very weak governing system of intergovernmental relations to produce a federal-provincial agreement, or as Marilyn would want me to say, a federal, provincial, and territories agreement. This is perhaps one of the weakest governing systems you can imagine. Any government can opt out at any time, and so we're driven down into lowest common denominator decisions. But I argue it's the only one we have available. We can't simply leave it to the provinces. We tried that during the Harper era, and the federal government then was taking no action itself, nor yet trying to coordinate federal provincial action. And a 2012 study by the National Roundtable showed the provinces were only putting in place about half of the policy effort needed. But nor yet will the provinces let the federal government be the only actor in the policy field. And this is shown right now. We have governments litigating to try and stop the federal government from acting. So my argument is it has to be federal provincial. So then in the book, I look at the 5 instances to date in which we have attempted to put together coordinated federal provincial policy in the area of energy or climate change, recognizing that now those two are very much integrated. So the first one, 1973 to 1981, was occasioned by the OPEC oil embargo. World prices went way up. Eastern Canada, which imports oil, suddenly was facing a much higher cost than the rest of the country. Alberta, which was supplying oil to other parts of the country, wanted to see the Canadian price go up to the world price. And at that time, the price was controlled by the federal government. Ontario, which was buying Alberta oil, did not want to see the price go up. So you had a real east-west division within the country. Plus, the federal government saw all of the oil tax revenues going to Alberta, almost none to the federal government, and wanted a slice of the pie. And that led Pierre Trudeau in 1980 to pull the trigger and put in place the National Energy Program with many provisions, but among them, new tax law, which was increasing federal taxes. Alberta fought back, but basically lost. The two then negotiated, they both compromised, they reached an agreement in 1981. And so I take this as an example of the ability of Canadian federal and provincial governments to arrive at coordinated policy when Ottawa is motivated and is willing to use muscle. The problem is it used too much muscle. The National Energy Program is a swear word in Western Canada, I think for very understandable reasons. Pierre Trudeau simply clobbered Alberta, and we can't do that. So I take a lesson from this one. We need strong federal action, but it needs to be done more carefully. Then the next two processes, the subject switched to climate change. This is under the Chrétien government. Federal provincial governments reached an agreement in 1995 for a national program. It only used voluntary action, so nobody was committed to anything, so it was relatively easy to reach agreement. In 1997, Prime Minister Chrétien committed the Canada to the Kyoto target after he had just previously agreed with the provinces on a different target, doing damage to the federal provincial system. We then restarted the process, but in the fall of 2002, when Prime Minister Chrétien ratified Kyoto, the process over the objections of all provinces, the process came to an end. Governments didn't meet anymore. The process ended in complete failure. The Canadian energy strategy was the provinces only. This was led by Alberta. Alberta was hoping that by means of this program, other provinces would agree to have a pipeline across their territory. They reached agreement, but it was an agreement which did not require anybody to do anything. It just listed all the things that governments could do if they wanted to work together. And then the Pan-Canadian framework, where we sit now, initially, everybody signed on except for Saskatchewan. That has changed with Ontario and Alberta pulling out. And we're now in a situation in which provinces representing a majority of the population and a majority of the emissions are opposed to the program. It seems something more needs to be done. So those are the 5 processes that I look at in the book in considerable detail. And for each, I'm looking at 4 subjects. First, I'm suggesting there are 3 fundamental challenges which need to be met before we can have more effective climate policy. And then the key question of how the federal government plays its cards as this process is going on. These are the 3 challenges. The first, the West-East divide. The oil-producing provinces have very different economic interests from the rest of the country. They make money by exporting oil and gas and having the associated emissions, other people don't. But the difficulty is that that difference of interest is overlaid on one of the major fault lines of Confederation, Western alienation. If the first fault line is relations between French-speaking Canadians and other Canadians, the second one is the fact that people in the West, to my mind, for very understandable and justified reasons, have considerable suspicion and distrust of the federal government. So this is one of the absolute problems that we have to address if we want to have effective, if we want to move us out of the two tracks that I was showing earlier. The second one comes from the fact that if you're going to achieve any given target, that means you're going to have a given sum of reduction of emissions. The 2030 target says we should get our emissions down to be a bit over 500 megatons. Right now, they're a bit over 700 megatons. You've got 200 megatons you're going to reduce. And even if the words never come out of your mouth, you are going to allocate those amongst the different sources. How much is coming from transportation, how much from buildings, how much from oil and gas. And also, you're going to allocate them amongst provinces. And it's a zero-sum allocation, and so it potentially opens the door to conflict. And then the third challenge is simply the federal-provincial process itself. As I mentioned, the fact that any government can opt out at any time, and we have no majority voting, and so you end up with very weak lowest common denominator agreements. Then the fourth subject which I examine is how the federal government acts. And in particular, as I was going through this analysis of the 5 cases, I was increasingly drawn to this subject of unilateral action taken by the federal government while it is engaged in multilateral negotiation and policy development. And that takes 2 forms. The first is the federal government can itself say, I'm going to take action to address one part of the problem and achieve part of the overall reduction that's needed. So an example of that is the clean fuel standard that the federal government is now developing. That's being done by federal law and policy, and it will contribute to achieving the total Canadian effort. But the other form of unilateral action is the federal government saying, I'm going to do something, but it's saying this as a threat in order to change provincial behavior. And the example there is the federal carbon tax. And I would imagine that Prime Minister Trudeau originally hoped that he would not be applying the federal carbon tax anywhere because provinces would be doing it. But he would have used it as a threat to change provincial behavior. And then the other means available to the federal government, these are the 3 basic means of exercising power that are recognized in the social sciences: threat, promise, and persuasion. In this case, promise, federal government can give money to help provinces with their reduction costs, and persuasion, it can try and convince provinces to act. So now, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and set out how I see the basic subject here, which is coordinated federal-provincial action. And I'm suggesting that it is useful to see coordination in any form as being behavior change. When actors are coordinating their behavior, they're behaving differently from the way they would if they were acting alone. So why do they do that? They're either subject to external pressure, or they themselves want to change their behavior and cooperate and coordinate. So in formal organizations, you find both of those at work, and it's relatively straightforward. The boss at the top gives orders, other people below change their behavior, but they also want to change their behavior because they want the organization to succeed. The difficulty is that Canadian intergovernmental relations are nothing like a formal organization. Their closest analogy is to international relations amongst sovereign states. So the federal government cannot give orders to any province to do anything, and nor yet are provinces all that interested in contributing to the national interest. Provinces are notoriously self-interested. They're looking after themselves. They're letting Ottawa worry about the national interest. So then, given all these difficulties, the way in the book that I analyze federal-provincial coordination is by borrowing from an analytical approach which is used in international relations. If any of you are familiar with the text Chasik et al., Global Environmental Politics, the view there is that multilateral environmental agreements come into play because governments play one of the four roles that are shown there. And so the example from international is Sweden in the 1960s was suffering from acid rain pollution blowing up from Europe to the south. It led the charge for an international agreement on acid rain. Here in Canadian intergovernmental relations, usually the lead role is played by Ottawa, although Alberta played the lead role in one of the processes, and we'll be talking about that. So then the other roles are to support, to play a swing role is to support if you get something, you bargain first, and then the veto role to try and slow it down or stop it. And basically, I'm saying that the exercise of power within intergovernmental relations is what decides coordination, and that the balance of power has to favor the lead over the veto. If it's the other way around, we do not see coordination. But there's another part to it. I had said coordination flows from external pressure and from internal desire. And so when we apply this here, we find the commonly accepted paradigm of a collective action problem in which self-interested actors realize they can't solve their problem by themselves, and so they coordinate. And this is one of the major things that leads to coordination at the international stage. So far in Canada, we have not seen that working with federal provincial programs in energy and climate. But when we get to the recommendations in a couple of minutes, I'm going to be suggesting a way, I hope, that we could change things so that Canadian governments, more specifically provinces and territories, would themselves want to achieve the common Canadian goal. So now I'm going to go through the findings and then recommendations, and that will be it. I'm giving findings from the 5 processes and then from the 4 subjects. And we've already covered a fair bit of this, so I can be fairly quick. So in the first process, Ottawa was the lead actor, and it simply had more power. It had more constitutional power, but it also had more political power than does Alberta, because Ottawa can get all the votes it needs from Ontario and Quebec. That's where the Canadian population is concentrated. It doesn't have to have Alberta votes, and Alberta basically lost. It won one of the legal battles, and it's not quite as straightforward, but Alberta was overpowered. However, Trudeau brought in the National Energy Program in September of 1980. Alberta immediately started to fight back, but also the 2 governments immediately went back to negotiation, and they did reach agreement. So this is why I give this as an example of substantial coordination, but I say this is something that we can't do again because of the damage it did. Brad Wall, when he resigned as Premier of Saskatchewan, the very last day in office, he was talking about the National Energy Program. And if you look back to the record, you'll probably find he was talking about it on his first day in office. That Pierre Trudeau did too much damage to Confederation. So it's a double-edged message that I'm taking from this first process. The second one, under Chrétien, when the subject had changed to climate policy, and at that time it was as though energy policy didn't exist, although for sure it was there. And Alberta, very much aware of what its interests, the danger to its interests by effective climate policy, was playing the veto role. But this time, because the Chrétien government didn't have anything like the motivation that the Pierre Trudeau government did, Alberta was more or less successful, and we saw minimal coordination. Second national process, again, Alberta is overcoming resistance by Ottawa. Now, to give Prime Minister Chrétien his due, no other countries in the 1990s were putting in place effective climate policy. We can't really blame him, but the situation was such that it favored the veto actor. What happened here is that in 2002, both Alberta and Ottawa, they didn't formally say they were pulling out of the process, but in effect they did. Alberta adopted a different target from the Canadian one, the same target it has always had ever since, that its emissions will continue to go up rather than down. And Ottawa moved to unilaterally itself regulate the sources and achieve the policy goal. So the federal-provincial process wasn't strong enough to keep those two actors in. And then when Chrétien ratified Kyoto over the objections of the provinces, the process wasn't strong enough to survive. The process itself ended. So the message that we take from this is the weakness of the federal-provincial process, and yet it is the only instrument we have, I argue, to achieve effective policy. Then the Canadian energy strategy from 2005 to 2015, the Harper government did not participate. It did at one point, and then it pulled out. The lead Alberta government, lead actor, wanting to get provinces to agree to a pipeline. Nobody was really resisting because there was nothing much to resist, because they weren't being asked to commit to anything. So you had an agreement signed, but again, minimal coordination. And then the Pan-Canadian framework, with Ottawa leading, originally BC and Ontario supporting, Alberta supporting in exchange for getting a guarantee that it would have a pipeline, and the veto role moving over to Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan has continued that veto role. Ontario and Alberta have now joined it. So originally it was successful coordination, now much less so. So then findings from the four subjects, in terms of the West-East divide, in all five processes, it was very much alive and present in the form of highly engaged and motivated Western carbon provinces. They will again be motivated in any future national effort, and they again are very, very likely to be playing a veto role. So this is the challenge we face. But at the same time, the eastern provinces for climate change have no inherent reason to be as motivated as the western provinces were. In the first one, Ontario, which is looking at a much higher price if Alberta got its way, a price for oil, was as motivated as Alberta. But as soon as the subject switched to climate change, Ontario didn't have that motivation. The Harris government was more or less allied with the Klein government in Alberta, trying to play a veto role to stop effective climate action. So what that means is that if any government is going to exert countervailing power to the power being exerted by the carbon provinces, which we know will be there, it has to be Ottawa. The allocation issue was not significant. It kept coming up through the various processes. The first process was all about allocation. It was dividing up the tax revenue between Alberta and Ottawa. But for all the others, allocation would appear, but it did not influence outcomes. And the reason for that is we've never come close to achieving a target. Every time we're a few years away from achieving the target, and we're many, many megatons above the target level, what we do is adopt a new target for 10 years in the future. And we congratulate ourselves on doing such a good job. But my argument is if we ever actually do come close to achieving a target, we're going to have to deal with the potential for conflict from the inescapable fact of the need to allocate. And I'm saying the way to do that is to put it on the table right from the outset, to follow the lead of the European Union and negotiate an explicit burden sharing agreement in which all governments commit to taking on a certain portion of the overall effort. Findings from the national process. The first, a province can't lead it. Alberta could not generate what it wanted out of the Canadian energy strategy or an effective agreement. A province does not have the power to issue threats to another province. It can't spend money to influence the behavior of other provinces, and it can only persuade. We saw last year Alberta briefly, when British Columbia was holding up the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Alberta saying, well, we're going to cut off the gasoline we ship to you. It was an attempt to issue a threat, but that's one of the rare instances. Generally speaking, a province can't lead a national process. Hence, of course, the fallback, it has to be Ottawa. But the second major finding to come out from this is that the process we use for setting targets builds in a lack of coordination right from the beginning. All of our targets have been set by Ottawa because it's off in the international arena, looking at what other countries are doing. It sets a target which is similar to what other countries are doing, most notably with an eye to the US. Then comes back home and tells the provinces, this is the target. The provinces, meanwhile, are all themselves, they have set many, many targets over the last 30 years, but they all do it unilaterally, even while they're engaged in a multilateral process. So in the recommendations, I focus in on this, on a way of trying to fix this problem. Then findings in terms of federal strategy, we have to have a motivated Ottawa government, and I suggest that that depends to a certain extent on ideology of the governing party, and to offer a realpolitik view, it means a conservative government in Ottawa is unlikely to be able to put in place or be interested in putting in place more effective climate policy. But beyond that, we need personal motivation from the Prime Minister, the kind we saw from both Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau, but not from Jean Chrétien. Ottawa has to use consistent, skillful diplomacy. We won't get coordination unless we have Ottawa using threat, promise, and persuasion, but it has to be careful because it can backfire. And I don't have time to go into it here, but there were examples in the way in which the Chrétien government would overstep and cause problems. Justin Trudeau made an error when he stood up in the House of Commons on October 3rd, 2016, and announced the federal carbon tax at the same moment that the ministers were off in Newfoundland meeting to negotiate the agreement. That was incredibly inept diplomacy. Okay, we're about to wrap up then. This is my set of recommendations. This will take about 5 minutes and we'll move into discussion. So the first, we have to stop pretending that the West-East divide doesn't exist. And again, here I draw an analogy with Quebec separatism. What we've done with Quebec ever since the 1995 referendum is just say to ourselves, boy, we're never going to reopen the Constitution again, and we just won't say anything about the problem of Quebec separatism, and maybe it'll go away. Well, perhaps, but we can't do that for climate change, the climate change problem. With Quebec, we're trying to stick to the status quo, that nobody changes the status quo. Here, with climate change, the status quo is the problem. It's the two tracks of emissions going up in part of the country and overwhelming in other parts. So we have to start talking about it. But we have to do it in a way which does not lead to acrimony and conflict. And my suggestion is we do that by focusing on how we can achieve a fair sharing of the cost. Then beyond that, I suggest that the rest of Canada has to accept that it cannot force Alberta to reduce its emissions. It's very likely that the federal government has constitutional power to do all kinds of things to Alberta emissions, but Canada isn't governed that way. We said to ourselves many years ago, we weren't going to force Quebec to stay in Confederation. Nobody is talking about sending the army into Quebec. We have to apply that same mindset here because this is the way Canada works. Ultimately, it's only Albertans who can decide that they're going to reduce their emissions. The other side of the coin, I would ask Albertans to recognize what they're doing, that they're free riding, that their plan is to increase their emissions right up to 2030. the emissions they are not making amount to about 100 megatons when we're trying to get down to a total of only 500. And they're asking other provinces to pick that up. But nobody talks about that. We have to start talking about it. So then I recommend that Ottawa start a new process or a revamped pan-Canadian process, but it not do what it's done every other time, which is to set a national target and then come back home and say to the provinces, this is it. Unfortunately, that's exactly what Justin Trudeau did in the last election. He set the net zero target. He didn't do it by talking to the provinces and saying, what do you think? He did it because other countries were doing it and he thought it sounded good. I shouldn't say that. I'll retract that. But certainly he did not set it by working with the provinces. He promised in his October 2015 election platform that he would work with the provinces to set the next target, but he never did. He simply went with the Harper target, and now he's pulled this one out himself. So I'm saying, instead of doing that, let's start a new process. Let's not have any target. Let's not talk about targets. Let's talk about what's a fair distribution of the cost. And then let's, with the provinces, out of that, a national target will emerge. Now, I'm not suggesting that Ottawa invite the premiers to come for a meeting, ask each of them what they're willing to do, and then put a seal on it and say that's the Canadian target. Instead, I'm saying Ottawa has to use all of the powers that it has of threat, promise, and persuasion to push that target up as high as you can, but not so high that Alberta and Saskatchewan opt out of the process. And if that were to happen, we could then get into the other source of coordination, which is provinces feeling that they are facing a collective action problem and wanting to achieve the Canadian target. And I'm saying we express all this in a burden sharing agreement, which would then also set new provincial targets, each one representing what each province was going to do. One way that we might have, there are many ways of achieving distributive justice, so I don't make a firm recommendation here, but one possibility is to say that everybody will be paying the same per capita reduction cost, and we can make that commitment to Alberta and Saskatchewan. We're not asking you to pay any more than the rest of the country, even though your reduction costs are higher. And that means we will get less absolute reduction per capita from those provinces, but they're more likely to stay in. And then my final recommendation, which may be one of the more controversial here, I'm talking to some friends and colleagues as I was working on this. I got a lot of people saying, Doug, don't you go in print saying this, but I really feel we have to accept the fact that this is a federal provincial process. The inherent logic is lowest common denominator. We have to keep Alberta and Saskatchewan in. We might end up with a national target less ambitious than what we have now. But the argument I make in the book is twofold. First, the targets that we've had ever since Brian Mulroney's target in 1990 have been meaningless. We've just breezed past them all. And then secondly, I argue they're actually counterproductive. They allow us to fool ourselves, to allow us to think that we're doing something on climate change because we keep setting such ambitious targets. And I'm saying a target that all governments had actually bought into would be far more valuable than any target we have had to date. So that's my list of recommendations. I'm going to turn things back over to Mark. This is my email address, and if any of you want to continue this discussion later today or tomorrow or next week, I would love to hear from you, and feel free to send me a note. Mark, back over to you.
Thanks, Doug. This is excellent. It's very interesting, and we will post the slide deck too if you'd like us to, along with the video when we get to that stage. So lots of potential questions there, and some challenges to the conventional wisdom about how to approach this. And so with that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. I'm seeing a couple of hands going up already. I saw one in the chat, but I do want to remind people to please do the questions using the raise hand function, as that makes it a lot easier for me to be able to manage things and keep track of who's on the speakers list. So we're going to start. The first one I saw here is Mike Bagg. I'm not sure who that is, but I will unmute you, and you have the floor, Mike.
Hi, thanks. My name is Mike Baggery, and I'm listening and watching from Winnipeg. I had a thought about how the target was, the Paris target being a 30% reduction by 2005 levels by 2030, and then it's being superseded in the IPCC gave its special report about 19 months ago, saying we have to be more ambitious, going 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. So do you think that having a weaker target would actually be not only easier to achieve, but that it might be easier to go beyond it to what we need, if that's...
I'm happy to respond to that, Mike. I agree completely that Canada should be having a much more ambitious effort than it has now. But the fact is that Canada faces a fairly unique problem. We are an oil and gas exporting nation. A big part of this country is analogous to Saudi Arabia. So we've got to get ourselves all on the same page of reducing emissions before we can start thinking about what you're quite rightly calling for, of then moving on to a more ambitious target.
Right. That's what I was. Yeah, I was thinking. Yes, I was thinking that. Thanks. It was what. That's. Oh, I had some more comments and then lost it.
Thank you. Next question, Stephen L. I have to unmute you. There we go.
Hi, Doug. Nice to actually see you again. I interviewed you when I was doing my grad school for a show called Beyond the Headlines. So it's good to talk to you again.
Nice to meet you, Stephen.
So I'm from Fort McMurray, Alberta, originally. I live in Toronto now. And I've noticed that over the past few years, the conversation around climate and the economy has gotten a bit toxic. And I don't know if you've kind of seen that as well on both sides, especially with the recent election of the UCP in Alberta. So I was kind of wondering what your thoughts are on the discussion around climate change in Canada, because you did mention that we have to let Albertans know what they're doing to the rest of the world by emitting so much carbon dioxide. But we also have to admit to ourselves and the rest of Canada who care about climate change that we might not get the drastic action that we might like to see. So I was wondering what your recommendations or your thoughts are on how the climate debate or discussion can be improved in order to have that conversation in a more healthy light, rather than kind of pointing fingers and blaming people in different provinces for, Albertans like to say that you're trying to, restrict the economy, and people in Ontario like to say that, Albertans are free riding. So how do you kind of see that discussion changing over the next few years if we do want to get to that healthy middle?
It's an excellent question. I certainly agree. The national dialogue has become more toxic. We saw this after the federal election in October of last year, that we had a Liberal minority government with absolutely no members of parliament from Alberta or Saskatchewan. And we had some 2/3 of Canadian voters supporting parties that were calling for more effective action on climate change. And right away, the premiers of Alberta and Saskatchewan started pointing to Western alienation and started demanding policies that would allow them to increase their emissions even more. And a large part of this, to my mind, is the fact that Western alienation is a completely understandable and justified phenomenon. The Western provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan came into Confederation in 1905, unlike Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, the other original provinces. They were not allowed to have ownership of their natural resources. The federal government held on to all that, and they didn't get it until 1930. Basically, the way Canada is run, Ontario and Quebec, the industrial axis, have exploited the two regions in the hinterlands, in the east and the west. And this is what makes this current climate change situation as difficult as it is. That is very understandable that people in Alberta take the position that, that they do. So then, to go to your specific question, Stephen, of how do I suggest we approach this, and how do we try and avoid it falling into finger pointing and acrimony? As I said in the presentation, I'm saying let's start by talking about what we can do together. And what we can do together is to reach agreement on what would be a fair sharing of the cost. The situation now with Alberta free riding and asking other people to pay all of the cost that it's refusing to pay is not fair. And so I'm asking respectfully Alberta to reflect on that, but also all Canadians to engage in discussion to see how we could have what we think is a fair sharing of the cost of the effort.
Very good, thank you. Next, I have Deborah Van Nijnatten. Deborah, are you there?
Yeah, sorry. I was trying to unmute myself.
I was unmuting you at the same time.
Oh we were both unmuting. So Doug, thanks so much. And the whole time you were talking, my mind was going a mile a minute because there's so much going on right now. So if we look at all of the conditions that you outline for us, it seems to me that the rules of the game may be changing right now. I want to take just one slice of it, and that is the fossil fuel economy. So, you know, I have been paying very close attention to what internationally is being said about the fossil fuel economy. I have been paying very close attention to what investors are saying about the fossil fuel economy. Huge concern about stranded assets, low prices that, you know, really since 2014 have been in place. It seems to me that the discussion about the future of the fossil fuel economy right now is different than it has been, that there is more urgency in terms of, you know, recognizing that it can't be a way forward, that this is another terrible bust cycle, that people in Alberta are suffering yet again, and, you know, and Saskatchewan, and, you know, we haven't even talked about Newfoundland. How do we think about moving forward? On the other side, you know, I've been reading about, well, renewables is the way forward because we can get them up quickly. So the rate of return on investment is really quick. So as a means of public stimulus, if you want to get shovels in the ground, boots on the ground, renewables is the way to do it, certainly at the beginning. I've been looking at the investment actions of the Texas oil and gas industry, of our own big companies, some of the global big companies, and they're focusing on renewables for the same reason. It's not climate change. It's not this toxic discussion that my Alberta colleague was talking about, which I totally agree with. We've got to do something different. It's about money. And the fossil fuel economy is not going to make money, and mega projects are too expensive, and we're not going to get our rate of return. It seems to me that this moment offers this opportunity to have a different kind of discussion, and it does give the federal government different levers. And I noticed, just a last kind of comment, that the clean sector, their statement that they came out with about 2 weeks ago about a green public stimulus package. One of their principles is very specifically that folks in Alberta, Saskatchewan, those who are so reliant on the fossil fuel economy must benefit the most from any kind of green public stimulus. So I'm just wondering what you think about some of these discussions now and whether this has changed the rules of the game, but also change what the players can do to leverage their position.
Well, it's an excellent question. In effect, Deborah, you're raising the question that Mark and I would have been suggesting we might want to spend a bit of time talking about. I've given you a package of analysis that was developed prior to March of this year, and now the world has been turned upside down. So let's launch in, because this is the world that we're in, and talk about it for a couple of minutes. I think, yes, that there may well be an opportunity. I saw something in the report on business, I think yesterday, that the renewable energy shares are doing fine. They're doing much better than fossil fuel. However, there's a couple of things that I would point to. The first is the fact that the Alberta government, so far at least, is doubling down on the fossil fuel economy. The Jason Kenney government bought a share of a pipeline. They're putting their money where their mouth is. So we're back to this same problem that I had talked about here of how can Confederation work? How can federal and provincial governments work together given that Alberta position? And so my suggestion would be that I tend to agree with everything you're saying about the opportunity, but the fact remains that we have to deal with Alberta. And for that, I would go back to my analysis of let's try and find a way that we can show Alberta, and this is the kind of thing that you had mentioned toward the end of your remarks, to show Alberta that we're not imposing any greater cost on Alberta than anybody else. The other couple of things that I'll throw in here in terms of how does Canadian climate change politics evolve in the era of COVID-19. On the one hand, perhaps there's an opportunity, and Mark and I have been talking about this for the last week or so, and let's hope that it does go that way. But there are a couple of things which possibly suggest it's not going to go that way. And the first is that I think as soon as we get some public opinion polling data, we're going to find the way we have every time before over the last 40 or 50 years, when the economy goes into recession, support for environmental action goes down. The economy now is not going into recession, it's going into depression of the level of the 1930s. And I think it's inevitable that we will see public support for action on climate change go down. It will not be at the level that it was in the last election. The second thing is that there's an analysis of the power of business within politics, that when times are good, the public is willing to support governments regulating business because they aren't worried about it having an effect on jobs. When times are bad, governments find it much harder to regulate business because the public is already worried about jobs and business is saying, hey, you're going to cost us more jobs. So David Vogel's 1989 book, Fluctuating Fortunes, it's a study of business power, and he sets out this argument. To the extent that he's right, this means that the oil industry is more powerful now than it was before the price of oil tanked. Has more political power, might have less economic power. So we have that problem. And then I believe, thirdly, you can carry that over to the position of Alberta within Confederation. If Alberta is looking, as Jason Kenney said they might be, at unemployment rates in the neighborhood of 25%, then it gets a lot harder to ask Alberta to do things which Alberta itself sees as threatening to unemployment rates. So like to think that this might be an opportunity, but there are other signs that say things could go the other way.
Thanks, Doug.
Next I have Jan McQuay, and then I've got a number of people who have been struggling with the raise hand function who have made requests through chat, so I'll go to them next, but Jan next. Oops.
You hear me?
Yeah, now we do.
Okay. I have a couple of questions. The main one being that Mother Nature doesn't negotiate. Climate change is driven by physics. And if we're going to deal with it, we have to recognize the physics. And that's what the United Nations has been saying for years. So if we negotiate something like 10% reduction, that's not gonna get us out of this pickle. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, I do have a comment. If we were to actually able to achieve a 10% reduction, we in Canada would be making incredible progress. The only time we've seen a reduction in Canadian emissions came from the 2008 recession, and we're likely seeing a reduction going on right now because the oil companies are cutting back production and people aren't driving their cars and so on. For us, a 10% reduction would be far more than anything we've done to date. And so I go back to the same comment I was making to Mike at the beginning of this, that, and I guess to Stephen as well, that I 100% agree. We should be doing far more than that. This is what we need. But we have to solve our unique Canadian problem. We have to get ourselves going in the same direction. And if we could do that and actually achieve 10% reduction coming out of policy instead of out of economic change, that would then provide a floor to go on to do more reductions, the kind of reductions we need.
My comment on that would be, again, that Mother Nature doesn't negotiate. 10% isn't good enough. We're going to get runaway global warming. And once it's runaway, then game over. We're going to have a mass extinction. But to go back to the to Alberta, the idea that Alberta only has fossil fuels as its resource doesn't recognize the fact that both Alberta, or southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, are the best places in Canada for insulation. They've got more solar power capability than, or not capability, but availability than anywhere else in Canada. So why not switch, at least to some extent, switch over? Why are they so resistant?
Well, they're resistant because they sit in a situation that God gave them. They've got oil and gas in the ground, and up until now, you could convert that into wealth. And they're doing what I think anybody else would in their situation. They're converting it to wealth. And so you're saying to them, boy, we have got a problem, and you should leave that oil and gas in the ground and move over to forms of renewable energy. It's a difficult thing to ask them to do. And so I come back to my basic message that we need to find a way to have that kind of a dialogue with our friends and colleagues in Alberta without forcing anything on them.
But God gave them sunshine.
Well, we may need to move from that thought. It is, I think it does in some ways go back to Deborah's point that it, though, requires also a recognition that what's happening in the oil and gas sector may be more structural than cyclical in Alberta, and that might help that conversation a bit. And we don't know. That's not where Mr. Kenny is going so far. But I do have a question from Francois, who was written in, a little bit change in pace. But asking, in your recommendations, you're proposing that Ottawa should use the process that had put in place for some of the free trade agreements, like the recent one with Europe. So all of the provinces are at the table to negotiate the federal target. That's an interesting thought that we may have some precedent in how some of the trade negotiations have been approached to trying to deal with this problem as well.
Well, my comment on that would be, yes, there may well be things we can learn there. Generally speaking, before Ottawa makes an international commitment for action which is not within federal jurisdiction, it pretty well has to go back and talk to the province and reach agreements with provinces before making that international commitment. And I think that's what's being referred to in the Canada-EU negotiations. The fact of the matter, however, is that in terms of setting climate change targets, that's never happened. In 1990, the Brian Mulroney government was engaged internationally, and this concept of saying that emissions would be stabilized at the 1990 level by the year 2000 was in vogue internationally, and a number of countries were signing on to that. So he took that. Then in 1997, we were coming up, getting ready for the Kyoto summit, and everybody knew countries were being asked to stake out their positions for what they're willing to do. The federal and provincial governments had this elaborate policy process by that time set up. They had a meeting in Regina. The federal government agreed that the Canadian position at Kyoto would be that they would still stabilize emissions, but the target would be changed from the year 2000 to the year 2012. Then, just a month later, the Ottawa negotiators were at Kyoto. In fact, even before that, the federal government itself got itself tied into knots trying to decide what the target would be. And Chrétien completely set aside the agreement he had reached with the provinces because he wanted to be close to the US. He cared more about what the US thought than what the provinces thought. So then he came back home, and there was a first ministers meeting scheduled for pretty well the next day. It had previously been scheduled. Ralph Klein went into that meeting really steamed up because Chrétien had broken the agreement that he had made and had committed Canada to the 6% below 1990 levels. So Chrétien said, okay, we'll spend the next 2 years simply studying the policy options before we actually do anything. And so Klein was happy. And so this process drove us into inaction. So then Prime Minister Harper in 2010, as part of the Copenhagen summit, adopted the same target that Obama had adopted, the 2020 target, but he never did anything to try and meet it. Then Jason Trudeau got elected in the fall of 2015, didn't do anything to try and meet the 2020 target, said he would negotiate with the provinces on what the next Canadian target would be, but instead adopted simply the Harper 2030 target. And then just a few months ago, he set all by himself yet another target. So if we can learn from the Canada-EU trade negotiations, I would hope it would be, let's not make international commitments which the provinces have not previously bought into.
Next, we have Andrew O'Brien, who had asked to ask a question. Andrew, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thanks, Dr. Macdonald. Really interesting talk for sure. So I guess my question really relates to, looking at it as us versus them type of thing. I mean, we all, particularly Ontario, we're still relying on the oil from Alberta. And I think in the current times, does this not, add to our national security, national sovereignty as well, while we still are relying on oil to, for example, and natural gas to provide electricity, to fuel our huge transportation sector, as particularly around the GTA. Like, I mean, before this pandemic happened, we were all, or a lot of us anyways, were guzzling automobiles all around the 401 and the DVP and Gardner Expressways. So, I mean, we're still very much connected, and fossil fuels are still the primary source of energy today. So how do we kind of skirt that and almost restructure and rebuild everything at the same time, and at the same time, to your point, not alienate Alberta, because it really is all of us together. And Canada won't be, in my opinion, the lone country in the world that gets rid of fossil fuels or stops relying on them. We've all got a furnace in our home as one example, and there's an entire infrastructure behind each furnace in all of our homes, all the pipes through our homes and under the ground. How do we pay for this this transition? I guess it's a loaded question, but those are the thoughts that kind of were spurred by your presentation from my point anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Those are valid points you're raising. So I guess I'll discuss just, I'll respond in terms of 2 points you raised. The first, how do we make the transition given the dependence that we all have on fossil fuels? That's the same problem that everybody is wrestling with. And so, yes, for sure, that's a big part of the problem. But what I'd like to talk about more would be the second point, your point of how do we avoid it being an us versus them kind of scenario. And I think your suggestion is an excellent way to start, by those of us living in Ontario publicly recognizing the dependence that we have upon Alberta fossil fuels. And from that, being able to say to people in Alberta that we are all in this together somehow. And then I come back to my basic point of, can we use that to then find a way that we can start to enter into a dialogue that will allow us to reach agreement on a fair sharing of the cost, starting from this supposition of all of us being in it together rather than us versus them.
Very good. Next, we have Alan Andrews, and then I'm going to go back to the raised hand list. So Alan, are you there?
Yes.
Oops, sorry. There, now you're unmuted.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Douglas. Alan Andrews. I'm the Climate Program Director at EcoJustice. Really interested in what you had to say. I should say that EcoJustice and a number of other NGOs, some of whom I hope are on the call, have been working very closely with the federal government, pushing for a climate law which incorporates most of the principles you've talked about, although I should say not the one about a weaker target, although I do see some attraction in what you're saying. You can probably understand that would be heresy.
EcoJustice is not publicly going to ever call for a weaker target.
No.
Nor yet should you.
Quite.
Do that to somebody like me.
So I've had to change my question because I think it's been covered by a previous question, but I do have one which I think kind of ties a few of these themes together. And it goes back to this point about how do we make Alberta and Saskatchewan see that these reductions or taking on a fair share of the burden is in their interests. And I was interested by your analogy with the EU, because one of the pushbacks we've had in discussions with government people is that, oh, well, the EU has huge sums of money that it can throw around to bring recalcitrant member states to the table. So, for example, Poland is a vast coal-producing economy, is kicking up a stink over the climate targets it's now facing under the EU's new package. But the EU can throw billions of euros at Poland through its structural funds. And so my question is, does the new economic reality that we are facing now present an opportunity whereby the federal government could actually have pretty significant funding streams that it could use to bring Alberta and Saskatchewan to the table?
It's an excellent point. We haven't talked about it yet, this use of financial compensation. We did a study a few years ago of the EU burden sharing process to see what Canada could learn. And one of the things that we looked at there was exactly as you say. In 2008, Poland was, which is heavily reliant on the coal industry, was reluctant. And there was a promise made that funds coming out of the EU trading system would be transferred over to Poland. The difficulty we've always had in Canada is Alberta and Saskatchewan, particularly Alberta. Alberta, on a per capita basis, is the richest Canadian province. And so to talk about compensating Alberta giving money to Alberta is always seemed to us as though it would be a hard political sell. Now you're saying perhaps the shoe is on a very different foot right now. Since March, things have really changed, and perhaps that opens up other possibilities. What I say in the book is that basically we should use all the kinds of mechanisms that we have available of financial transfers or provinces paying for reductions that are being made in other provinces. But then once we've used all those possible mechanisms, I come back to this basic notion of saying we're not going to ask any one part of the country to pay more than any other part of the country. But certainly this comes down, at the end of the day, it comes down to my mind, and this is, as I say, this is the inevitable, inescapable fact that any given reduction represents a total dollar cost. It may represent in the longer term a dollar opportunity and benefit to come, but in the short term, it's a cost. And the political issue always is how do we divide up any given cost? So if we can find ways using compensation, by all means, let's do it.
Next, I have Tom Cullen. Oops, there. Should be unmuted.
Okay.
There we go.
Thanks very much. First of all, I just got to get in there that what struck me in your conclusions about was that it seemed like we're negotiating what color to paint the living room, not that we've got a scientific phenomenon like the COVID that's coming, whether we like it or not. Anyway, I know you violently agree with me in terms of Canada needs much better targets, so I'm sort of horrified at the prospect of reducing them. Anyway, I guess the second point, which is also a question, is that fairness is a very loaded word. The implicit price of carbon per ton for Ontario getting rid of all our coal plants was in the order of over $100 a ton. So in some respects, Ontarians have paid hundreds of millions of dollars already to get off coal. It's difficult to see how we should help bear the cost of Alberta getting off coal for their electricity. And I guess the other point is that different other resources we've had to leave in the ground, whether it's asbestos in Quebec, or well, we just screwed the entire fishing situation off the East Coast, so it's not like they're still there and they're leaving them in the water. They're just not there anymore. And forestry comes to mind in terms of the pine beetle in BC. So there are other resource-based industries that we've had to let go for various reasons. And the tar sands, the oil sands, is some of the most expensive oil in the world. So it seems like if we're going to leave some in the ground, it's the right stuff to leave. I guess my question is, I was on actually another call earlier today, and there were discussions about the carbon club in Europe, that they're actually discussing using the premise of a tariff, I gather, internationally to help the free riding countries come on board with a price on carbon pollution. I'm wondering if that could be used in an analogous way within the Federation of Canada.
Thank you, Tom. These are excellent points you're raising. Let me just park the concept of a tariff or a border adjustment tax or a tariff and go back to some of the things you were saying initially, because I want to agree with a couple of things you're saying. You said that fairness is a loaded word, and absolutely. There's all kinds of ways that you can see a fair distribution of whatever the benefit is. So we're all sitting around the table and we're going to divide up the chocolate cake. And start by saying, well, everybody should get shares so they're the same size. But then somebody says, well, wait a minute, one person actually put in way more work than everybody else baking the cake, shouldn't they get a bigger piece? And it goes on from there. So certainly you have that problem. And then if you're talking about the price that Ontario has already paid, I think that's quite fair to put that on the table. But the point I would make is that there's no forum, there is no table right now to talk about this, because Canadian governments will not recognize the problem that we have of emissions going up in the Western carbon provinces and going down in others. So there's no opportunity to talk about this. During the second of the two climate processes under the Chrétien government, Quebec did raise the issue of a burden sharing agreement. And it said, that's what we need. And this fit the agenda of the Parti Québécois that was in government at the time. It wanted to simply say, we're going to act like a sovereign country and take on a certain portion of the reduction effort, and we want everybody else to agree. And nobody, the federal government wouldn't go with that, other provinces wouldn't go with that. They set up a task force to look at it, but nobody had their heart in it. So my argument would be that yes, fairness is difficult to reach agreement on what's a fair division, but let's at least provide ourselves a forum within which we can begin those discussions. In terms of other resource industries, absolutely. I talk in the concluding pages of my book, I make an analogy with the situation we're in now with what happened to the Newfoundland fishery. And basically, we lost a resource that had economic wealth. And what happened was that the rest of the country came in to help Newfoundland, doing it through the vehicle of the federal government and retraining programs. Now, it was easier, in Newfoundland at the time, before the oil wealth, was a have-not province. It's a lot easier to talk about that, just as it's easier to talk about compensating Poland. But still, we do have these examples, and I think we need to do the same thing again here, that we need to talk about possibly compensating Alberta as part of the effort to try and find what everybody agrees is a fair sharing with Alberta. In terms of your last point on using tariffs, bringing in internal tariffs within Canada for part of the country to be punishing other parts of the country by means of a tariff seems to me really counterproductive to what we're trying to do. If the general thrust of this conversation is trying to get away from us versus them to we're all in this together and how can we share the cost, I find it hard to see how internal tariffs could really help that process. But I'm open to discussion. If you want to send me an email and we'll go further, I'd love to do that.
Well, can I just follow up? Yeah, I fully agree that hitting each other over the head with a stick is hardly a good way to negotiate. I guess I just thought, or you mentioned in your remarks that some of the thinking was analogous to international negotiations, and I'm wondering if there's some better cases that don't use the T word, but are there examples how international discussions could help inform us more about how to get a good agreement within Canada?
My basic comment would be that yes, perhaps we could draw on international, and certainly I do, because the method I use for understanding Canadian intergovernmental comes from international. And the first point in that lesson is you need somebody to play the lead role. So for a while in the 1970s and the 1980s, the United States, the hegemonic power, was playing that kind of role in terms of international environmental agreements. And we were able to achieve success in things like the 1987 Montreal Protocol to phase out ozone depleting substances. The US has then backed away from that role because of internal politics. The EU is attempting to play that role. The EU has various challenges just coming from the fact of of being the EU. But my basic argument would be that we can learn from the international to the extent that you need a committed, careful, motivated lead actor. And here, that can only be Ottawa. So I may have said, hey, let's not use internal tariffs, but I am saying, let's use power. Let's bring power into intergovernmental relations. Again, something that is never talked about. Everybody talks, everything is so collegial and happy and we all get along together and so on. But the reality is somebody has to exert some power. And that person, that actor, has to be Ottawa. However, it can come back to bite you. It can cause problems. So you need to use threat of power in a very careful way. And at the same time, Ottawa has to do more than it has to bring the provinces and territories into the decision-making process. So the term I use in the book is collaborative federalism glove within an iron hand.
Thank you.
Very good. Are there last call for questions? I saw Marilyn. I don't know if I accidentally lowered your hand. So this might be our last question, Marilyn. I unmute you, and we should be good to go. Oops, hang on, not yet. There.
Okay, good. So a couple of comments. As people were talking, I started to think back to 1976 when I was living in Alberta. And that was when Peter Lougheed brought in the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund, very much with the idea that petroleum resources would be running out. And while the province was getting considerable funds as a result of those resources, this was going to be a fund set up to help diversify the Alberta economy. Now, I was also Googling as people were talking, and I understand that the Alberta government has been dipping into this fund, and so it's not nearly as substantial as what Norway has. But certainly, perhaps Albertans could be reminded of Peter Lougheed telling them that petroleum resources would be coming to an end, and people would have to be diversifying and looking for other elements for their economy. So it's sort of reminding some people of what was being said decades ago. More currently, with COVID-19, and Doug and I have talked about some of this in the last few weeks, but I see some positives in terms of the extent of cooperation that appears to be happening between various levels of government as they're dealing with that. At the same time, with the very substantial expenditures by governments to deal with the various ramifications in the economy, there's going to be far less flexibility for various governments to put into funding other priorities when they start to come back to the fore. I thought it was interesting earlier this week when the federal government was announcing how it was going to be providing funding for major corporations and having as a condition that they would have to show how they were contributing to sustainability. And then when people were saying, oh, but that's excluding the oil patch, the response was, well, actually, some of the major petroleum corporations are telling us how they are going to be going to much lower emissions. So they would not be excluded necessarily as a result. And we're also seeing that people are starting to appreciate that with the reduced demand for carbon resources, we're being given a fresh start in a way that, you know, there's less pollution and air quality is better, and so that might increase people's desire for really more serious action on dealing with climate change. So there's sort of pros and cons in terms of what governments are dealing with now with COVID-19 and how that might be impacting, and when they start to be paying more attention again to the issues of climate change. I'll just mention a sort of third topic, and that having been involved in international negotiations with the federal government for quite a few years, provinces and the federal government would be talking in advance of at least most of the negotiations I was familiar with as to what would be the positions that the federal government would take. And there was a lot of input by the provinces, and often there would be provincial representatives on federal delegations, so that, you know, as there were the delegation meetings which started each day, there would be discussions back and forth as to what were the provincial views and how the federal government should be responding to the different issues that were coming forward at an international meeting. However, as Doug has pointed out in his book, with the Prime Minister representing Canada, he can decide to go it alone, as Prime Minister Chrétien did. So while internationally in negotiations there is considerable give and take between federal and provincial and territorial governments on different issues, and how Canadian positions are put forward internationally, in this case, it doesn't always happen.
Doug?
So, Doug, have you been giving further thought in terms of how you see with COVID-19 and approaches to the federal government, and have you been hearing from others with their ideas and suggestions about how the sort of the appetite for what you're putting forward in shaping federal positions in the next little while on climate change and energy policy?
Doug?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll respond to your last point. In terms of the federal appetite, the Prime Minister hasn't phoned me up and said, gee, Doug, I just read your book and we're just going to do it all.
Yeah, has he got the book?
In terms of the points you raised, I'll just go through them in order of Peter Lockheed establishing the Heritage Fund. The politics of that at the time were that it made much more visible the fact that as oil prices were starting to move up toward the world level, there were a series of federal provincial negotiations, and Alberta got some of what it wanted. So the price was moving up, so he created this fund, and it made that much more visible the fact that all the benefits of higher oil prices were flowing to Alberta and were not flowing to Ottawa. It was one of the major things that motivated Pierre Trudeau. The fact remains, if they had not then depleted that fund, if they now had it available on the same scale that Norway does, all of this discussion, everything we're talking about is basically this transition away from a fossil fuel economy to something else would be made that much easier. But the fact of the matter is that we are where we are now. In terms of COVID-19 and federal support to the energy industry, basically the dialogue we're having this afternoon is looking at two possibilities. One, coming out of the COVID emergency is a new, fairer world, which is transitioning away from fossil fuels and is helping the workers rather than the firms. And the other one that I'm suggesting may happen that actually the industry is even more powerful than it ever was. The federal government has done two things to help the oil industry. It provided a couple of $2 billion worth of funding to help with orphaned or abandoned remediation of oil wells in Alberta and British Columbia. And so what struck me as significant about that was it was helping the industry, because it's not just firms that have gone bankrupt and have left these oil sites to be cleaned up. It's also existing firms which had that liability on their books. And as I understand it, the federal government is coming in and saying, no, you don't have that liability anymore because it's been socialized. We're going to pay at least a part of it. But Trudeau, it seems, felt that he had to dress up his aid to the oil industry in an environmental garb. And that might give some credence to people who might suggest, no, public opinion and public support for action on climate change has not completely evaporated. And then the announcement this week, the way that's of aid to the large companies, the way that's being presented in the paper in the last couple of days, is that the federal government was wanting to hide the fact that it was helping the oil industry by making it a program for everybody. And that supports this same view, that at least the federal government is feeling that it has to pay some attention to environment, if nothing else, than optics. And then in terms of your third point, is the same thing that we've touched on with a couple of speakers of, can we learn from the international process? And I've suggested that yes, we can. But I guess I should really clarify here that what I'm suggesting is that we don't set the next target in the international arena. That's been the difficulty, that that all the previous targets have been set by Ottawa. All the countries are making commitments, so Ottawa feels it has to, and so it makes these unilateral commitments. So I'm not suggesting, above and beyond consulting the provinces when you're in the international arena, I'm saying let's set a whole new target at home ourselves based on negotiating an equitable sharing of costs, and with the provinces having a full say in setting it at home. And then Ottawa goes back into the international arena and says, okay, this is now the Canadian position.
Thanks, Doug. Not a question, an observation, but of course that international dynamic is very complicated in and of itself. And once it's engaged, it does have a life of its own. I mean, one can't understand the leader-to-leader pressures that heads of government come under at that stage, and it complicates the landscape quite a bit. Our last question I'm going to give to Lily, who had her hand up for a long time, and then I think we'll be pretty ready to wrap at that stage. So Lily, you've got the floor. If I can unmute you successfully. Let's see. Hello. There we go. There we go. We got it.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for allowing me to ask my question. And hi, Doug. So
Hi.
There was a question in the chat from Andrew O'Brien, which from Stephen N., which I found was interesting, and I kind of wanted to point out to it and add a little question to it. He mentions that intergovernment coordination, which is essentially what you're stating regarding the provinces starting the conversation, and then the federal government to help with making our target from within. He mentions that municipalities represent about 90% of Canadians, hence a huge role to drive down emissions, which being just a person in this wide country, I can agree with. So I was wondering, how would you describe the coordination if you were to implicate municipalities into those discussions? Now, I understand that municipalities, provinces, and federal don't have the same power structure nor the same responsibilities to natural resources and climate-related issues specifically, but they still, in the end, touched down to, in the end, the population will have an effect on it. So.
Yes, it's a valid point that you're raising. The other valid point that goes right along with that is what's the role of Indigenous peoples in any new federal provincial process? And nowadays we pretty much feel that Indigenous peoples need to be given some kind of a voice whenever we have federal provincial decision making going on. In terms of the role of municipalities, you're quite right when you say that they have different powers. They don't have the constitutional power. They have no constitutional basis at all. So the fact is, yes, they are playing a very important role in actual abatement of greenhouse gas emissions, but on the intergovernmental stage, in terms as is driven by the Canadian Constitution, they start from way behind of not having a voice. The other comment I would make about municipalities, and I have many colleagues who teach urban governance and who disagree violently with everything I'm about to say, but that municipalities are inherently very, very weak policy actors. They can only govern within a relatively small geographic area. So they get together and they form associations of municipalities, but it's like provinces trying to influence other provinces. Municipalities don't have any ability to influence one another, and they can't really, they speak with one voice in terms of we'd like to get more money, but there's limits to what they can do. Their powers of enforcement, relying on bylaws, are much weaker than the senior levels of government, and they're dependent upon senior levels of government for anywhere up to half or more of their revenues. So yes, I would argue that if we're going to start a new process, let's make it as inclusive as we can. I mean, I also argue let's include the oil industry in it, actually, in the book. My argument is they're going to be in there speaking, the oil industry is going to be in there speaking privately into the ear of government. Let's at least bring it out, give them a voice. Let's bring in the NGOs. Let's have eco-justice there. Let's have Indigenous peoples. Let's have municipalities. But at its heart, it comes down to agreements amongst the federal government, provinces, and territories. And that's what we really need to find. And then at the heart of all that, going back to the very beginning of all this, the two tracks of Canadian climate policy, it's finding a way that Alberta and Saskatchewan, and to a lesser extent, perhaps Newfoundland and perhaps British Columbia, can be induced to see that making a transition away to a different form of economy would actually be in their own self-interest.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've exhausted our supply of questions and possibly exhausted Doug as well. So I think on that note, that's a very good question, though, to end on both the question of Indigenous people and of municipalities in this conversation. But I want to thank Doug very much. This has been excellent. This has been a fascinating discussion. As I mentioned, we've recorded the session and we will post it on the Sustainable Energy Initiative website. And it's our hope that we, as I mentioned, this was as much reunion as book launch. And our hope is that we will be able one day again to all meet for real and do this properly at U of T somewhere, maybe Hart House, maybe Massey College, where I'm supposed to be the York Massey visitor next year. And we will see you all then. But thank you very much. It was lovely to see everyone, many old friends and some new ones as well now. And we will see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.